Major Hans-Ulrich Rudel's lone Du-87. Stuka, its distinctive siren silent, cruised at a modest 3,000 meters above the Soviet rail lines near Kursk. The date was July 5, 1943. His current task was purely to gather data. The command had tasked him with photographing the density of the enemy's armored reserves and infrastructure in the rear before the major thrust of Operation Citadel. Intelligence suggested the Soviets had moved significant tank repair and staging facilities further from the front line, a move the Luftwaffe needed to confirm. But as Rudel peered down through the haze, the scene below shocked him into a cold sweat. The rail yard and adjacent staging area were not just busy, they were overflowing. Hundreds of vehicles were tightly parked, T-34 tanks, self-propelled guns, supply trucks, and troop carriers, all crammed together. The area usually reserved for transient logistics now looked like a massive stationary steel fist. Fuel bowsers loaded with volatile aviation and diesel fuel were lined up in neat, devastating rows adjacent to the armored vehicles. Maintenance crews were swarming, working under temporary lights, clearly preparing for an imminent move. Rudel's quick estimation put the count at over 40 fully operational, reserve Soviet tanks and accompanying vehicles. A devastating strike force poised to disrupt the German offensive before it even gained momentum. He knew exactly what they were waiting for. The massive German armored assault, the largest tank battle in history, was scheduled to begin within the next few hours. These 40-plus tanks were ready to plug any breach or launch a crippling counterattack on the German flanks. Rudel's standing orders were unequivocal. A reconnaissance mission meant observing, recording, and reporting. He was to transmit the coordinates, note the enemy strength, and return immediately to base near Kharkov, allowing the general staff to assemble a full-scale, coordinated Stuka Geschwader squadron strike. An intelligence pilot's duty was to be the eye, not the fist, especially not alone against such a formidable concentration, likely protected by newly deployed anti-aircraft batteries. However, Rudel possessed a deep, intuitive understanding of the chain of command, or rather, its inevitable sluggishness. By the time he landed, debriefed, and the paperwork was filed, and a major strike package was organized and launched, a process involving multiple headquarters and hours of delay, the Soviets would have inevitably dispersed their priceless armored reserve. They would be hidden in tree lines behind ridges, or worst of all, already on the move to the front. The German armored divisions driving into the Kursk salient couldn't afford this strategic reserve, hitting them from the rear or flank. The threat needed to be neutralized not in the morning, but now. Rudel gained a little altitude, meticulously studying the complex setup below. In their haste to move and conceal such a large force, the Soviet planners had made a profound tactical error. The sheer number of vehicles forced them to park nose to tail, surrounded by exposed, unprotected fuel stores. A single, well-placed explosive hit could detonate a localized inferno, potentially triggering a catastrophic domino effect that could consume the entire staging area. He checked his ordnance. His Stuka carried a modest but potent payload: a single SC-500 bomb beneath the fuselage and 4 concentrated 20mm cannons in the wings, firing high explosive rounds. It wasn't nearly enough to destroy over 40 armored vehicles individually, but it was more than enough to ignite a firestorm. Before we dive deeper into the extraordinary, rule-breaking attack that followed, take a moment to hit the subscribe button below. We bring you the most compelling and little-known stories of incredible courage and tactical genius from throughout history. Let me know in the comments if you have heard of Rudel's solo strikes on the Eastern Front and where you're watching from. Hans-Ulrich Rudel was not a pilot prone to rash decisions. At this stage of the war, he was already an ace decorated for daring, precision ground attacks. He had flown hundreds of sorties, survived direct hits from ground fire, dodged countless Soviet fighters, and pressed home attacks in weather that grounded his entire unit. He understood the razor-thin line separating extraordinary bravery from sheer, pointless recklessness. What he was about to do was straddle that line with the utmost care. An attack now meant he would instantly become the sole target of every operational anti-aircraft gun and machine gun nest defending the yard. He would be flying without any wingman to suppress the concentrated ground fire or to provide crucial cover on his exit. His Ju-87 was heavily armored, but a lucky shot. A single shell hitting the engine block or the pilot's cockpit would turn the dive bomber into a tumbling coffin with no hope of retrieval deep behind enemy lines. Yet inaction was a far worse prospect. Those 40-plus tanks would soon be organized into powerful Kampfgruppen battle groups, prepared to execute a devastating counterthrust. Soviet armored tactics were focused on mass and momentum. These tanks would engage the advancing German columns, shattering their formations and inflicting massive casualties on the infantry and supporting armor. Rudel had witnessed firsthand the catastrophic results of encountering unprepared massed enemy armor. He had flown low-level support at Stalingrad, where Soviet tank reserves, appearing seemingly from nowhere, decimated German forward positions. He'd watched helplessly as armored columns rolled over positions that had no anti-tank defense or air cover. The decision was swift, taking less than 20 seconds. Rudel pushed the control column forward and rolled the Stuka into a steep dive. The altimeter spun rapidly as he plummeted toward the Russian steppe. His plan was brutally simple and required absolute precision. Come in on a shallow dive, use the bomb on the densest part of the armored park, saturate the fuel stores with cannon fire, and exit the kill zone at maximum speed before the gunners could zero in. At 1,000 meters, he pulled the aircraft into a near-horizontal run, pushing the throttle to its limits. The Stuka, a slow bird by nature, still surged forward, roaring across the fields at nearly 350 km/h. The rail yard burst into view through a screen of pines. Soviet maintenance crews looked up in utter astonishment as the distinctive shape of the German plane hurtled low over their heads. Most froze in shock. Others dove for cover. Crucially, few reached their heavy anti-aircraft positions in time. Rudel's targeting system locked onto a cluster of tanks and a large fuel depot. He released the single SC-500 bomb. It plummeted perfectly, detonating with a concussive roar in the center of the tank park. The blast wave instantly shredded the light armor of 3 T-34s and ruptured a massive fuel pipeline. Aviation fuel sprayed everywhere, instantly catching fire. Without hesitation, Rudel squeezed the trigger for his cannon burst. All 4 cannons hammered out a concentrated stream of 20mm high-explosive rounds. The tracers walked across the tarmac, stitching a line right through the exposed fuel bowsers. The bowsers disintegrated under the fire, the diesel exploding in a massive rolling fireball that instantly engulfed the surrounding tanks and trucks. The resulting explosion was far more violent than Rudel had calculated. Flames shot hundreds of feet into the air, and the blast wave violently buffeted the Stuka as he pulled up sharply to avoid flying through the plume. Behind him, the devastation spread with terrifying speed. The initial blast and fire ignited the reserve ammunition stored in the nearby supply trucks. That fire spread to the next vehicle, then the next, each explosion setting off the secondary stores of the one beside it. Within seconds, a third of the complex was a raging inferno. Soviet ground personnel ran in panic, abandoning all attempts to save the remaining vehicles. Finally, the anti-aircraft gunners reacted, opening fire with a coordinated, desperate barrage. But Rudel was already climbing, maneuvering violently to prevent them from locking onto his flight path. Tracers arced past his canopy. He felt several punishing impacts shudder through the airframe as 20mm and 37mm rounds smashed into his armored fuselage and wing root. Warning lights immediately flashed on the panel, but the robust Junker's engine roared on, refusing to quit. He banked hard left, gaining height and making a wide, calculating circle. Below him, the scene was one of apocalyptic destruction. Nearly 20 tanks and dozens of trucks were burning, the flames spreading across the yard like a liquid tide. A huge column of black smoke boiled thousands of feet into the summer sky, visible for almost 100 kilometers. However, on the far eastern end of the rail yard, at least 20 more armored vehicles sat untouched, still a viable reserve. Rudel checked his ammo counters, critically low. Perhaps 3 seconds of concentrated cannon fire remained. The anti-aircraft crews were now fully alert, tracking his every move as he circled. Returning for a second pass was tantamount to a suicide run. He rolled the Stuka onto its back and dove again without a moment's hesitation. This time, the anti-aircraft fire was immediate, a concentrated sheet of flak rising to meet him. Tracers filled the air around his plane like a massive swarm of angry hornets. He jerked the control stick left, then right, never maintaining a straight line long enough for the gunners to calculate a lead. The Stuka was violently buffeted by several more impacts. Metal shrieked as shells tore through the control surfaces of the tail. Rudel roared in from a new, unexpected direction, targeting the untouched line of tanks on the eastern perimeter. His remaining cannon rounds hammered into the vehicles, ripping apart engine decks, shredding the crew hatches, and puncturing fuel tanks. He walked his fire directly into a critical ammunition bunker, which detonated with enough force to lift a nearby heavy artillery piece off the ground and flip it. The secondary explosion started immediately. Burning fuel from the destroyed tanks ignited the rest of the supply crates. The tank's own high explosive shells began to cook off, tearing the thick armor plating apart from within. Rudel's guns fell silent, empty. He had fired every single round. The Stuka felt dangerously heavy as he pulled up. Damaged hydraulics and control cables made the controls numb and unresponsive. More warning lights flared. Fuel was leaking from a ruptured tank, leaving a thin, oily plume of smoke. But below him, the entire rail yard was an inferno. Every tank, every supply truck, every structure was engulfed in fire. The smoke column was a monument to destruction. Rudel nursed the heavily damaged Stuka east toward the German lines. The controls were slack, the oil pressure was critically low, and he wasn't certain the landing gear would even deploy. The flight back felt like an eternity, the initial rush of adrenaline replaced by the grim realization of his actions. He had directly and flagrantly disobeyed standing orders. Instead of merely recording the damage, he had personally launched a single-handed assault on a major military objective. A court-martial, or at least a severe reprimand from the high command, was a certainty. But the alternative, watching those 40-plus tanks smash into the German offensive, was a punishment far worse than any the Luftwaffe could inflict. The forward German airfield appeared on the horizon. Rudel radioed his base, reporting severe damage and requesting an emergency landing. The runway was immediately cleared. His landing gear struggled to deploy, one wheel hanging precariously. He came in hot and fast, slamming the wounded Stuka onto the grass strip, the violent impact buckling the fuselage. Ground crews rushed the aircraft, stunned by the sheer extent of the damage. The tail section was ripped to shreds. The wings were peppered with over a dozen gaping holes. The paint was scorched black from flying through the close-range explosions. Rudel climbed out of the battered cockpit to face a group of stern-faced officers. The squadron commander demanded to know why a reconnaissance aircraft had returned in such a state. The intelligence officer wanted to know exactly what the hell had transpired over the rail lines. Rudel's report was clipped and simple. The rail yard was not a depot. It was an armored staging area packed with over 40 reserve tanks preparing for a counterattack. I destroyed them. All of them. The officers stared in disbelief. The intelligence officer requested confirmation of the number. 40 armored vehicles destroyed by one pilot in one aircraft. It was an unbelievable claim. Aerial reconnaissance photographs taken the next morning confirmed his word. The rail staging area was a smoking ruin. Not a single tank or operational vehicle remained. The photos showed the burnt-out, shattered hulks of precisely 40-plus Soviet armored vehicles scattered across a blackened, blasted yard. Fuel dumps were craters. The logistical structures were rubble. Intelligence immediately revised its assessment of Soviet reserve strength for the Kursk engagement. Instead of facing a devastating armored flank attack, the German advance would proceed with significantly less threat to its logistical rear. The primary Soviet counterattack reserve in that sector had been eliminated by one pilot who had dared to defy direct instructions. The High Command, despite the clear insubordination, awarded Rudel the Knight's Cross with oak leaves, the highest decoration for military valor at that time. The citation praised his extraordinary heroism and decisive independent action against overwhelming enemy forces. His decision to attack had directly preserved German forces. However, the Battle of Kursk that followed was still a bloodbath. The tank battles lasted for weeks and cost Germany its strategic offensive capacity. Yet, without Rudel's lone strike, the casualties and the tactical disruption would have been incalculably worse. Those 40-plus tanks, launching a coordinated, concentrated attack on the German logistical tail, would have caused chaos and disruption at the most crucial phase of the assault. Military analysts later estimated that Rudel's solo attack potentially saved thousands of German lives and maintained the cohesion of the advance. His 8 minutes of ferocious combat achieved what a full wing of bombers might have, and he accomplished it at the one critical moment before the enemy could disperse its forces. Rudel, throughout his legendary career, always downplayed the attack. When asked, he would simply state, "I saw a target that needed to be destroyed, and I destroyed it." But not every pilot would have. Most would have adhered rigidly to the reconnaissance mission's parameters, radioed the report, and allowed the ponderous machinery of command to organize a strike. That procedural adherence would have gifted the Soviets the critical time they needed to maneuver. Rudel's willingness to reject caution and trust his own immediate assessment made all the difference in that crucial hour. His story remains a foundational case study in military tactical training to this day. The immense value of initiative at the ground level. Rudel could not have known with certainty that his decision was correct. He was gambling on his interpretation of Soviet intent, betting his life on his ability to execute the attack flawlessly. Every rule, every standard operating procedure screamed caution, report and return. But Rudel intuitively understood that sometimes the pilot on the ground, seeing the immediate situation with his own eyes, possesses a superior judgment to commanders viewing maps kilometers away. His willingness to act decisively, even in direct violation of his orders, exemplified the principle of mission command. The High Command recognized this by bestowing the highest honors instead of a court-martial. They tacitly acknowledged that rigid adherence to the letter of the law would have resulted in strategic disaster. Rudel's disobedience was the highest form of serving the mission's ultimate intent. Modern military strategists study Rudel's attack not only for its audacious flying, but for the psychological and decisional framework it established under extreme pressure. The military teaches that sometimes following the letter of the instruction means forfeiting an opportunity that will never arise again. The attack also showcased unparalleled target prioritization. Rudel didn't waste his limited ordnance trying to destroy every tank individually. He instantly identified the exposed fuel bowsers in the central pipeline as the critical vulnerability and exploited it mercilessly. One bomb in the right place, followed by a torrent of cannon fire into the volatile fuel stores, achieved more than 100 scattered bombing runs. His low-level, high-speed approach from multiple, unpredictable vectors minimized his exposure to the concentrated anti-aircraft defenses, demonstrating tactical brilliance beyond mere bravery. And critically, he knew precisely when to disengage. After firing his final round, he did not loiter or circle to assess the total damage. He got out. The mission was accomplished. Staying an extra moment would have been a useless, fatal risk. Every single one of these decisions was made in a fraction of a second under a hail of fire, without time for consultation or careful calculation. Rudel's rigorous training and his vast combat experience allowed him to execute split-second choices that proved to be universally correct. Hans-Ulrich Röhrl survived the war and became one of the most decorated pilots in history. The mission reports, the reconnaissance photos, and the subsequent official history confirm what seems almost too theatrical to be true. One man, one battered aircraft, 8 minutes of pure hell, 40-plus enemy vehicles destroyed, and a major flank threat eliminated. In the final analysis, Rudel's single-handed strike near Kursk stands as one of the most successful independent combat actions of the entire war. His minutes of furious combat neutralized what would have been a catastrophic disruption to the largest armored battle ever fought. The soldiers fighting on the front lines never knew that one pilot had ignored his orders to save them from a surprise attack. They fought through hell, facing the full might of the Soviet defense, but at least they weren't hit from the rear by a fresh, concentrated reserve of tanks. Sometimes the most heroic action a soldier can take is to refuse to follow an order. Not out of cowardice or spite, but because the immediate, self-evident truth of the situation demands an action that rigid procedure prevents. Rudel understood this truth instinctively. When faced with the critical choice between doing precisely what he was told and doing the one thing that needed to be done, he chose the mission's intent over the instruction's rigidity. His legacy endures in tactical schools worldwide, which now teach initiative over absolute obedience, adaptation over rigidity, and the paramount importance of trusting the informed judgment of the person on the spot. The military learned from Rudel and his legendary attack that sometimes the best course of action is the one that no one ordered you to take. The next time you encounter a situation where following the rules feels profoundly wrong, where the established procedure conflicts with an obvious, pressing necessity, remember Hans Ulrich Rudel circling low over that Soviet rail yard. He knew what had to happen. He knew the immense career-ending risk if he failed, and he did it anyway because the alternative, the loss of his comrades and the failure of the mission, was a cost too high to bear.